Welcome to the SWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here again with one of our gracious guest hosts, Nora, who comes to us from an HR background. And we actually had a lot of good feedback from our series on D&I. And we actually had a question for Nora, which we'll delve into and then talk a little bit more about things like allyship and some of the initiatives that are coming up. So we can hone in a little bit more on the different things that are happening in D&I. So the question came from someone who, you're identified as a person of color, right? And she is a newcomer that came in, and she had a question on like, well, how does one as a person of color break into HR? Because she has the understanding or the perception that HR is largely not diverse, which is interesting because they are the champions of diversity, yet they themselves is not necessarily a diverse population. So what are some thoughts around that? What has your experience been around that? And then could you actually answer that question of how could someone who identifies as a person of color break into HR, if you have any specific tips on that? So that's kind of the background and thoughts, and would love your insights.
Thanks for having me again, Luki. And I'm really happy to hear that we're engaging with people online and that we're getting questions. Happy to answer any questions anybody does have or any suggestions people do have on what kind of content they'd like to hear. Please feel free to share it with myself or Luki. And in regards to that question about, being a newcomer to Canada, first off, welcome. I'm sure you're going to find that this country and city is awesome. Like I found it, and very welcoming. In regards to being a person of color in HR, my experience hasn't necessarily been that as a person of color or UERG, there's lack of diversity within the HR department per se. I've seen lack of diversity more so from a gender perspective. So HR has always been heavier on the females than the males. And I think that we have some work to do to balance that. But that might be some people's perceptions because HR departments are usually a little bit small in organizations, right? We are a support function. Some people call us a cost center, which I don't like to say. And I think that this ratio is probably different now that we have a lot of technology to help us with our work. But back when I was in school, for every 100 employees, the ratio was one HR professional to support, right? So when you look at that, there's not a lot of HR room or a lot of HR openings like other roles. So, if you are looking in a specific organization that lacks diversity or is having challenges attracting diverse candidates, because the HR department is so small, it might be less representative of its full UERG demographic, you might feel that it's not the most diverse. From my experience, typically HR professionals do value diversity. They, have or try to be as unbiased as possible in their hiring practices, kind of like practice what you preach.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do find an organization where, their HR practices or their HR recruitment policies and isn't aligning with your values and diversity isn't mentioned anywhere on their careers page or in the recruitment process, then maybe that's just not an organization that their values align with yours or the culture would necessarily work for you. And as a person breaking in, I'd say one of the biggest things is network. So reach out to as many HR professionals as you can. We're pretty friendly. We love to talk to people about career development because that's our passion and that's what we do. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of organizations within the GTA and Ontario that help connect newcomers that are professionals with large organizations. One of them that comes to mind in the GTA that's pretty big is Triac, right? So there's a lot of mentorship programs. There's a job board for employers, and there's networking opportunities. So I'd also encourage you to look at the different committees and organizations within your community as well for additional support during your transition.
That's amazing. And what I heard from that is from a like a BIPOC perspective, there's not really any focus bias on that. It's just really because it's a 1 to 100 type
Yeah.
of thing where it's so small that that the representation isn't necessarily there. It's interesting that it's kind of skewed on the female side versus the male, because you often see that differently in other functions. But glad that there's things being undertaken to kind of move forward. And the other part about the breaking into it, it sounds like it's not that much different than in any other function. It's just because
Yeah.
the function is so much smaller that you just have to do a better job. And I think where most folks, when they hear the word like networking, they just try to get an informational interview, a coffee chat, a Zoom chat, or whatever it is, and then that's it, right? Whereas a lot of times it's that building of the relationship, getting that person to maybe coach, advise, getting some advice even, versus really connecting to that person just for the purpose of getting a job. That often doesn't come off very well in that. And thanks for sharing some of the resources too, that I hope folks will be able to take on their own and put it into place to find their opportunities. I'd love to kind of shift a little bit to the topic of allyship, right? So um, we talked in our previous episode a little bit on that, and if you can chat a little bit about how we can help, how we can become allies, or what is being an ally all about. And some of the backdrop of it is I was having a conversation with someone, and it was related to kind of D&I, and they had a question on a specific type of allyship where people put like their pronouns in their names, right? And they kind of asked me, well, can I do that? Do I need permission to do that? And I found that to be a very interesting question. So what are your thoughts on that and other things, as well as like the different types of allyship? Because that's obviously for one particular group, but what are some of the other areas of allyship that we should know about?
Yeah, and that's a really good question about, the pronouns and can I put them? Do I need to ask permission? I sometimes think that because people are not well equipped and they haven't been trained or educated on how to have what we call courageous conversations. So,
Mm,
conversations about race, racism, identity, allyship, openly, either within their personal lives or their professional lives. They think that something like pronouns is something that they need to ask approval for, or they don't know how to approach that conversation or who to ask. Even though, in my point of view, again, this is an opinionated conversation, it is
of
just my
course.
opinion. I think that, anybody can put their pronouns if they want, as long as you understand what you're putting out there, and you're going to ask people as well, give the same courtesy if you are going to put your pronouns out there, to ask people how they would like to be identified. So you know pronouns are important because people have the right to be called by their pronoun, and how
Yep.
they personally identify. And you might not specifically know a person's gender identity just by simply looking at them, right?
Mhm.
And it can be hurtful to assume somebody's pronouns, and it's disrespectful as well. So using an individual's name and pronouns it's an important way to demonstrate courtesy, not just allyship, but courtesy, right? It could be a way to demonstrate allyship as well, supporting individuals that choose to identify with non-binary pronouns, and something to keep in mind as well, while people are sharing how they like to be identified, that can change, right?
Mhm.
Understanding one's gender identity can be a process, and somebody might come to realize that they identify with a different pronoun later on down the line, and their gender identity is changed.
Mhm.
Many, but not all, are typically non-binary. There are some gender fluid individuals, and they use gender neutral pronouns, right? Like they, them, their. And some people use he, him, she, her. So it's not something that I'd necessarily say that you need approval for, that's for sure. And it's something that could be cleared up with, just a quick conversation with somebody that might be more experienced in this space, or a quick Google search. But um, some tips if somebody wants to start being a little bit more aware and start approaching that conversations. If you don't know, if somebody doesn't have their email signature or hasn't made it clear in the conversation how they'd like to be identified, ask.
Mhm.
You're coming from a place of learning and positive intent, and I'm pretty sure that most people, if they've been asked that thoughtful question, aren't going to take that negatively. And don't make a big deal out of your mistakes, right? If you unintentionally use a pronoun or mistake, the way a person identifies, you can just apologize, right?
Right.
And I always like to say, with D and I, for a lot of people, it's just they're just beginning their learning journey, and it's an ongoing journey of growth and learning. So come with the intent of positive, come with positive intent and understanding. And if you get something wrong, apologize. It's not a big deal. And if you trying to implement this in your professional workspace, just put it in your email signature, right? That's a way where you can start letting people know how you like to be identified, or starting to get into that conversation a little bit. There's also some things that we say in our typical conversational English language that, as we start to think about how people want to be identified, that we might want to take a moment before we say this, and rephrase it. When somebody says, "Ladies and gentlemen," right, or something that I always say, "You guys." Maybe replace that with more of a neutral words like "hello, everybody" or "folks." When we see on a job posting that they blatantly say, his or her job responsibilities, like we've seen, some people identify as non-binary, and that actually doesn't apply to them. So also, a lot of organizations now are making sure that their job postings are gender neutral, and there's a lot of online tools to help screen also the wording to help combat that if you're in HR. Um, Another common saying that, again, I've been guilty of saying is something like manpower, right?
Mm.
Or how many man hours is this going to take? We don't have to say man hours. We can
Yeah.
say work hours or how many hours it's going to take. So, when you're saying these things, just take a moment, reflect, take a step back, and say, what can I use instead? And that's also going to help that positive culture change, and help get us away from being, very, very specific and non-inclusive with our languages to moving towards more neutral language. So, it's a little long-winded, but for the individual that doesn't know what to do or if they need approval, I encourage them to, start off by putting your pronouns in your email signature. And, if somebody hasn't made it clear how they'd like to be identified, ask them. Ask them, and I'm pretty sure 9 times out of 10, that question will be appreciated.
That's amazing. And what I took from that is I actually love what you said about that courageous conversations. I think that that's so important, and I think it starts with that awareness and the willingness to be curious and have the discussion. And it sounds like that in those discussions, like people appreciate that you're making the effort, whether it's right or wrong, right?
Yeah.
I guess on the counter side, where people don't want to seem foolish if that person is not as a part of that community and saying, "Oh, what do you take me for? I'm straight," or whatever, and hopefully I'm not saying any of the wrong words. But sometimes people are don't want to say because of that. So having that courage to say, "Oh, sorry, I just had that feeling for whatever reason." Is there a better way of doing that, or an easier way of doing that, or is it just, well, get out there and make the mistakes, and once in a while you'll make a mistake, kind of that 1 out of 10, but those 9 out of 10 you'll feel super appreciated in those cases.
Yeah, and Luki, I'd also say take it based on scenario to scenario,
Mhm.
right? In a lot of scenarios, somebody will introduce themselves, and in a lot of ways, the way they're describing themselves, or whatever the case is, either clear is male or female, or they themselves say I identify as they or their. So take it situation by situation, and I think that if somebody mistakes you asking what their pronouns are for whether or not you're mistaking them for their sexual orientation, then that's a great learning opportunity, because
Mhm.
just because you identify as, she, they, or non-binary doesn't necessarily mean that your sexual orientation is one way or another.
Right.
So I think that it would be a great learning opportunity, even if they got taken back. I think that they would they would appreciate the learning opportunity, because I'm sure that if that's their response, then they're probably in their workplace worried or not sure how to approach gender pronouns.
That's interesting because I'm almost thinking that now that's almost like a teaching moment where by their
Yeah,
reaction, you're uncovering some sort of bias on their side that they should be aware of in doing that. So
exactly.
I think that's actually an interesting way to put it, is saying actually by them responding negatively, it's actually a good thing for them to be learning about. So you're doing them a favor by kind of putting it out. So that's a very interesting perspective. So that question was on kind of for the how you identify from a gender perspective, but the other ones where it's things like the whole BIPOC and the race, so the Black Lives Matter, the Stop Asian Hate and that sort of stuff. Are there other ways where we could support like the allyship from there, or in other areas of allyship? What are some examples that we could potentially take upon ourselves in order to represent our allyship?
Yeah. Again, and I always like to clarify that this is an opinionated, this is just an opinion-based conversations. Where I'm
Sure.
coming from is based on my experience in work and life, and my knowledge thus far, but I'm continuously learning. And what allyship today to me, it means that an individual, actively works to support and advocate for an oppressed group,
Mm.
and an underrepresented group, and an underadvantaged group. So somebody from a place of privilege. Um, and when you mention, all of these different communities, how can we be allies, or how can we, help? You can use that example in the workplace, right? If you are somebody that's been identified as a from a well-represented group, and have had privilege as a result of being from a well-represented group, you can sponsor or champion a individual that is most likely a strong employee, and it's a high performer. There are a lot of high performers that are BIPOC, people that just, don't have the skill sets, or English is their second language, or just haven't had the opportunity to network internally for various reasons, biases, or whatever the case is. And you can champion and advocate for them internally in the organization, whether that be through mentorship, whether that be championing them for certain roles or opportunities. Another way to be an ally and support is understanding, what certain communities are dealing with, and what are some of the systematic barriers and biases that these communities have dealt with, and coming from a place of learning, taking that back and seeing how can you, from a place of privilege, help lift those barriers, and that community, and help advocate, whether that is, again, bias through hiring, or not only bias through hiring. There's a big difference between having a diverse organization and having representation across levels and leadership, right? So looking at, have certain people from ethnicities, or people with English as their second language, have they been able to progress, and been given the same opportunities internally through promotions? Has their performance been evaluated the same, or are they working twice as hard to get the same, or a lesser performance review, right?
Right.
Things like that. I think that allyship is a process where an individual is coming from a place of learning, wants to help, and again, as an ally, you are coming from um, a place of privilege, and you're actively involved to end oppression for particularly specific group or community. And I'd also say, and I've experienced this in the past, when people, want to be allies, and I appreciate it, but sometimes as an ally, if you want to be an ally, before you put the onus and the responsibility of people from a BIPOC community to explain to you their struggle, or the barriers they face, or their challenges, do your own research, take the time, because it's exhausting it's exhausting, and a lot of people, they don't want to be, they don't have to, and they don't need to be the individuals that continuously educate every single person on their community scenario or their community struggle or barriers. And as an ally, some things when you're coming into this conversation, they might trigger you. So
Mm.
kind of do your own work and figure out how you've participated in oppressive systems in the past, what might trigger you, how can you grow through this process as well as an individual, and how can you change the systems based on your own privilege and power around you, and be aware of your implicit bias, right? Take a moment and see, like, have I been biased without knowing? Where's that? Where are my blind spots, and how I can fix it? I think that's kind of like the basic thing that you need to do, if you want to start to be an ally, and um, don't assume that every single person from a specific group feels the same way or has the same point of view as well. So yeah, do the research, understand, but also be open that different individuals of color all have varying experiences, right? So also don't take that assumption it's just not one stamp for all the South Asian community or all the Black and African American community, right? Everybody has different experiences. So just be open to continuously learning, and don't come from a place of assumption.
Yeah,
Yeah, so those are just some ways that I think that you'd want to start, some of the things that you want to start looking into if you want to be a strong ally and advocate.
yeah, and I'm learning a lot myself. So I think it's amazing. Where again, it goes back to the coming from a place of learning and curiosity. I think it is great, and also what you mentioned about understanding a particular place of privilege, right? So you're fortunate in whatever area, where you're in the opposite side of the community, well, on the other side of the representation scale. So if you're in that majority side, then think about, well, I mean, be grateful for all the privileges you have that this other group might not necessarily have, and then hopefully you can kind of elevate everybody, because I think we're all better together than individually. Um, and a lot of it is learning to your point about your blind spots, right? Biases in
Yeah.
certain ways, and chances are if those biases are in that area, they're probably in other areas too. So those are things that you'd want to know of. But yeah,
I might also just say something about allies that I might get some heat for this comment, but
good.
a lot of them sometimes feel guilty. And I find that they feel guilty about, their privilege or the opportunities or the power they have because they're a well-represented group. And I don't particularly feel that guilt, or a lot of guilt, is a really healthy emotion to carry. I don't feel that it's a positive emotion. I think that once somebody reflects and can self-identify as an individual with some form of privilege and can help in some way, then don't feel guilty and move forward, because at the end of the day, it's not one person who's built a system, or it's not one person that's created these systematic barriers. So harboring that guilt, I find, is not specifically the most positive, and I've seen it come across the way different allies approach different things, or the way they talk. And I don't think that they need to be harboring those negative feelings towards their privilege, as long as they recognize it, and they're doing something positive about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And what comes to mind is that, well, none of it was any of our choices, right? It was just kind of the luck of the draw that the universe gave you whatever it gave you. So
Exactly.
you shouldn't feel guilty for that. Just be unabashedly you, and own it in whatever area that you ended up over, under, majority, minority, whatever it is. Just be you. So I think that's amazing. One thing that we talked about when we were off camera was an initiative that you had undertaken in regards to like a video series. So can you tell me a little bit more about that, and some of the great things that came out of it?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I think contributes to positive D&I culture is culture. Positive D&I within an organization is culture, and talking about D&I and having courageous conversations. And one of the most successful ways that I've seen that being done in my career so far is through the storytelling technique. People relate to individuals more so when they hear your personal story, right? And they also can relate to senior leaders on a more personal level when they hear their personal story. So one of the things that we've done in my current company is that we've reached out to senior leaders that were UERGs, and allies, and have done and were active in DNI within the community and in the organization, and ask them to share their story, their experiences. Some of them were newcomers to Canada, some of them were first generation Canadians, but worked in a really remote location and were the only colored person in the whole office, right? Some of them were the only female on their team. So it was really interesting to hear all of their stories, their perspectives, their thoughts on also how, DNI has improved over the years in organizations, how the conversation has changed. And we find that sharing your story was successful because it helped us, start those conversations and contribute to the DNI education that we wanted to contribute to and provide employees, but also drew people in because it's personal, right? A lot of people want to know people's personal stories. A lot of people feel that they might be able to relate to them. It makes people feel more connected, that they're not alone if they've shared similar experience. And then from a leader perspective as well, especially from a senior leadership, it also, I believe, humanizes you a little bit, right? Because as senior leaders, you don't usually get to talk to your frontline employees on a day-to-day basis. You're just some, picture in the HR system or the org chart that people see and they never speak to. So it also, I think, it almost kills two birds with one stone. It helps people get to know you a little bit better, and then positively contributes to that ongoing DNI conversation.
Yeah, I think what I take from that is it's that storytelling element, making people more relatable and helping people understand that we're all human, right? So you've gone to similar
Exactly.
experiences in whatever aspect, and certain populations have gone through different sorts, but it's unique because, not, as you mentioned before, just because you're part of a population doesn't mean you went through that. You could be part of the majority, or whatever it is, and still have gone through something that someone in a different population had gone through. So they're all unique, and to be able to say, oh yeah, they've gone through that, and now they are a head of the department or a VP or whatever it is, then it shows and provides hope for the others that could be me too one day. So I think that's a great initiative, and yeah, we'd love to have you back and talk a little bit more on DNI or other things that are happening in the HR realm, or whatever is new and interesting in the life and career of Nora. Right. But thanks so much for joining us again, Nora, and hopefully we have you back for a future episode.
Thanks, Luki. Have a great long weekend. Thanks for
Take care.
having me.
Thanks for joining us on the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at LukiDanu, LukiDanu, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.